My name is Abbie, and thank you for coming. I will be talking about writing in my 5th grade classroom. I've entitled the presentation, Let's Allow This. Don't write them off. Helping 5th grade writers grow. So I noticed that in my 5th grade classroom at JCDS, the variation among writers was huge. I wondered how to identify and support such diverse individual needs in such an essential skill set. Which led me to my question for this project. What challenges do students face when they're writing and when they're learning to write? And how can I provide appropriate instruction and coaching? In order to answer this question, I selected 3 focal students from my 5th grade classroom at JCDS. I will be calling them Adam, Matt, and Alana, and hopefully you'll remember to use those. I purposely chose students with very different skill sets, attitudes, abilities in regards to writing, hoping to represent a wide spectrum of different kinds of student writers. I gathered several different sources of data about these students. I interviewed 2 of their current teachers, my mentor teachers, and I interviewed a former teacher of theirs. I also interviewed the students themselves. I took lots of notes during in-class writing times. I audio recorded some one-on-one writing conferences that I had with them, and I gathered student work from throughout the year. So altogether, I had a lot of information to sift through. I decided to start with the interviews because I thought that would give me a lot of information on who the students were. So I started by analyzing my interview data by creating this one giant chart. What you see here is one small corner of that chart. For each focal student, I created sections for each category of information that I was interested in. So those were their writing preferences, their writing strengths and challenges, their attitudes towards writing, and what they still need to learn about writing. I went through my interviews and I filled in quotes from what the students said about themselves, what each of the 3 teachers that I interviewed said about them, and kind of sorted out the information that way. So you can see here, Adam said about himself that he hates writing prompts in general, and he liked doing his paragraph about the Python games. Some of his teachers said things like he prefers artistic outlets and other quotes here. So once I had all my quotes, I created a new column where I pulled out the main points from my interview quotes and listed them. I did this for Matt and I did this for Alana, and I ended up with this giant chart with so many words. I couldn't just look at this chart and know who my students were. So I decided to organize the information visually using a website called Poplet, which I use with my students all the time this year. For each student, I created this graphic organizer writer profile where I took the info from my summary columns and I put them around that student. So here you can see with Adam, I have a place for each category of information, what he said about himself, what his teacher said about him. So through creating these writer profiles, plus examining all my notes and the student work that I collected, I got this really clear picture of who each student was as a writer. I decided to classify my 3 focal students into types, and I'll explain why I put that in quotes in a moment. So I called Adam a reticent writer, meaning that he's quiet and unexpressive in his writing. I called Matt an unrestrained writer, and Alana an anxious writer. I thought these types would be useful because I can look at these traits and think of how to help the students. I could also look for these traits in future students and think about how to help them grow based on what I did with these 3 students. The important caveat is that these are by no means fixed traits. Students are not certain boxes and they can and do change over time. So I decided to call Adam a reticent writer because he does not readily reveal his thoughts in writing. Here's just an example of one of his literature responses where you can see there's quite a few crossouts and scribbles. Matt is an unrestrained writer because he doesn't feel inhibited when he writes. He generally goes straight from what's on his mind to what's on his paper. It kind of flows. Here you can see he filled up 2 pages with his thoughts about a question. Alana is an anxious writer because she tends to make things more complicated for herself by becoming overly concerned about what she's supposed to be doing, what the expectations are. So that leads her to often include more details than necessary. I want to note that despite these 3 descriptions here, by the end of the year, all of these students visibly changed. They were starting to grow out of these categories. Adam was starting to speak up more when he needed help with something. Matt was using templates to plan and structure his paragraphs. And Alana was starting to become more adept at filtering out what details were important to include and what details were less important to include. So once I really felt like I knew these writers, I stepped outside my own data and explored some of the literature on teaching students to write. I read parts of The Art of Teaching Writing by Lucy Calkins, and as I was reading that, parts of my data really started to click. So in her discussion of one-on-one writing conferences, Calkins explains, if we can keep only one thing in mind, and I fail at this half the time, is that we are teaching the writer and not the writing. Our decisions must be guided by what might help this writer, rather than what might help this writing. If the piece of writing gets better, but the writer has learned nothing that will help him or her on another day on another piece, then the conference was a waste of everyone's time. These are harsh words, and she even goes on to add that a conference that helps the writing could even be harmful because it teaches students to become reliant on their teachers rather than trusting their own ideas. It was comforting to hear that the writing expert herself fails at this half the time because I certainly feel like I failed at it often. Before I read what Calkins had to say, I viewed my role in conferences as helping each student work towards the best written product that he or she was capable of. I now realize that the decisions I make about how to support students in their writing need to be about the student and not about the specific task. So with the insight that in my future teaching, I need to follow this advice and direct my interventions towards the writer and not the writing, I could return to my focal students. I decided to think about what I could do if I could go back in time, and I would have framed some of my conferences differently. I could have helped Adam think about what an introductory paragraph needs, rather than sitting with him and walking him through writing one. I could have sat with Alana while she ranked her ideas in order of importance, rather than answering her questions of, should I include this sentence, should I include this sentence, should I include this sentence? Alana especially is a student who doesn't trust her own reactions. And even though our conferences helped her create really beautiful written products, they didn't do much for her self-confidence as a writer. My third insight from this inquiry is that when teachers provide opportunities for students to reflect on their thinking and their writing, the students gain more control over their craft. Like the previous insight, I was led to this idea by Lucy Calkins. In The Art of Teaching Writing, Calkins explains that as children become increasingly self-aware and self-reflective, their writing becomes more intentional and mature. Calkins writes, if we give upper elementary children the chance to talk about their thinking, writing, and reading processes, many of them will become astonishingly articulate about their fleeting, intangible mental activities. And when children can describe what they're doing as they're writing and share their thoughts, when students can describe what they're doing as they write, it adds enormously to their dawning sense of deliberateness and their control over their writing. So according to Calkins, what it comes down to is metacognition, awareness of your own thinking. The best way to help writers at this age grow is to provide opportunities to talk about what's going on in their heads as they write. This realization led me to notice a new pattern in my data. When Adam writes, he doesn't ask a lot of questions. He doesn't do much verbal reflection about his thinking. Matt and Alana, on the other hand, often ask questions and often share what their thoughts are. In their interviews, both Matt and Alana had a lot to say about their strengths and their weaknesses and their preferences, whereas Adam was quieter about those topics. So according to Calkins, Adam, who does not appear to be so naturally metacognitive, he would be expected to have less control over his craft than Matt and Alana, who naturally tend to reflect thoughtfully about their writing. And indeed, when Adam writes, he has trouble self-starting. He produces little output. Alana and Matt, on the other hand, produce a wealth of output and end up with kind of more polished pieces of writing. Taken together, this inquiry into student writing has made me realize that in my future teaching, I need to be thinking bigger than the specific task at hand. If I really get to know my students, both as students and as writers, I will be well equipped to help them grow. And to best help them grow, I will need to step back from the individual pieces of writing and think about what will help them as writers in the long run. One thing that I'm sure will help all of my students in the long run is to encourage this metacognition. I will try to provide opportunities for them to reflect on their writing processes so they can start to gain more awareness and more control over what they're doing as they write. So thank you very much for listening to what I have to say. I would love to hear any questions or comments that came up for you. Oh yeah, Haley.
So I was, first of all, I just want to thank you. I love seeing where your research project is into and how you were able to really use Lucy Cobb's ideas to think really seriously about your students. And I'm wondering, as you head into next year and you're coming in with some real goals and things that, like, you want to try to do, is there anything that you see as obstacles to that, or what might get in your way of carrying out or trying these new ideas that you're very excited about?
I think that the way writing units are framed tend to be about, okay, we're going to work on this project right now. We're going to write narrative pieces or research pieces. So the framing of it itself is based on the pieces. Whereas as the teacher, my job will be getting to know my students and thinking about, okay, I don't care so much about this piece. I care about where the student is going. At the same time, I need to get them to be writing the piece in order to move through the process. So I think it's going to be really hard to kind of separate myself out from what I have to get done. I also think that timing-wise, it's so easy to forget to stop and take those moments to reflect. I think that I'm going to have a lot of students and I'm one person and there's this many subjects that I need to get through, but I think it will be so key to block those parts of my schedule. In the beginning, in the middle, at the end of every writing assignment, what am I thinking? What's my plan? Where am I going? Why did I do what I did?